Let's bow our heads and pray. Lord God, we put ourselves in your presence so that you may guide us down the road to righteous and selfless service in the name of the Filipino people. Almighty Lord, as we prepare to begin our work, we humbly pray that the infinite wisdom of your holy word will inspire us to execute the trust of public service with competence, integrity, and devotion. Temper our hearts with mercy, Lord God, so that our words and deeds as legislators will be shaped by understanding and compassion for the sick, the marginalized, and downtrodden. Cast the light of your heavenly kingdom upon our world, Holy Father, so that we may see clearly the ills of crime, corruption, and poverty that continue to plague our country. Suffice our souls with the fortitude and vigor, Almighty Lord, so that we may work faithfully to cure the social ills for the glory of your righteous name. Lord God, we pray that your eternal love will bind us together as a united Filipino nation, so together we may build the progressive, equitable, and just society you have envisioned for us, your faithful children. This is our prayer. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. The CEO Malolo Singers will lead us in singing the Philippine National Anthem, and afterwards they will sing another song for us.
Sa langit mong bugaw, may ilan
Thank you, CEU Malolo Singers. Secretary, please call the roll.
The Honorable Senators Angara, Aquino, Binay, De Lima, Drilon, Ejercito, Escudero, Gatchalian, Gordon, Honasan, Ontiveros, Lacson, Ligarda, Pacquiao, Pangilinan, Po, Recto, Soto, Trillanes, Villanueva, Villa, Zuberi, Senate President Pimentel.
With 21 senators present, the chair declares the presence of a quorum. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I move that we dispense with the reading of the Journal of the 15th Session, Wednesday, August 30, 2017, and consider the same as approved.
There is a motion to dispense with the reading of the Journal of Wednesday, August 30, 2017, and to consider the same as approved. Any objection? Hearing none, the motion is approved.
Mr. President,
Yes, sir.
we have guests today in the Senate, in the gallery and in the VIP gallery. Firstly, we have the group from the Miss World organization. Julia Morley, Chairman and CEO of Miss World Organization from England and founder of Beauty with a Purpose. We also have Chief Zweliweli Mandela. His Royal Highness is the eldest grandson of former President Nelson Mandela. Chief Mandela is the head of Royal House of Mandela. He is the leading member of the African National Congress and a member of Parliament of the Republic of South Africa. We also have Mr. Steve Douglas, Miss World Event Director, Arnold Vega Fria, Chairman and National Director, Miss World Philippine Organization, and we have Miss World 2016 and her court, Miss World 2016, Stephanie Del Valle Diaz from Puerto Rico, Mr. World 2016, Rohit Khandelwal from India, Miss World Caribbean, Yaritza Reyes Ramirez from Dominican Republic, Miss World Asia, Natasha Manuela from Indonesia, Miss World Europe, Lenti Franz from Belgium, Miss World Americas, Audra Mari from United States, Miss World Oceania, Madeline Cao from Australia, Miss World Africa, Evelyn Jambi from Kenya, Scott and Gina Holmes, Miss World Executive Beauty with a Purpose, Roshni Pandey, Miss World Public Relations Manager, Joseph Warwick, the Miss World Location Manager, and Vivian Grant Harris, Miss World Health and Safety Team. Also, Mr. President, we have guests of Senator Legarda and Senator Pacquiao, and my guest, Governor Ryan Louis Singson of Ilocos Sur. We also have visitors of Senator Grace Poe, the Young Centrist Union of the Philippines, NCR chapter headed by Attorney Paudak, and visitors of Senator Pangilinan, Governor Shari Ann Tan of Samar Province, the LGA Executive Director. Also, we have the high school students from the University of the East, Manila, headed by Mr. Sumalinog, and the senior high school students from Child Development and Guidance Center of Cavite, Cavite, headed by Miss Lori Sobong. We'd like to welcome them to the Senate, Mr. President.
Welcome to all of our guests.
Mr. President, I move that we proceed with the reference of business.
Any objection? Hearing none, the motion is approved. Go ahead, Mr. Secretary.
Messages from the House of Representatives. A letter from the House of Representatives informing the Senate that on 23 August 2017 it passed the following House bills in which it requests the concurrence of the Senate. 6136 entitled An Act declaring the 25th day of August of every year as the National Technical Vocational Day.
Referred to the Committee on Rules.
6152, an act increasing the normal work hours per day under a compressed work week scheme, amending Articles 83, 87, and 91 of Presidential Decree Number 442 as amended, otherwise known as the Labor Code of the Philippines.
To the Committee on Labor, Employment, and Human Resources Development.
2433, an act creating two additional branches of the Regional Trial Court in the province of Batangas to be stationed in the municipalities of Santo Tomas and Agoncillo, amending for the purpose Section 14, Paragraph A of Batas, Pambansa Bilang 129, otherwise known as the Judiciary Reorganization Act of 1980 as amended, and appropriating funds therefore.
To the Committees on Justice and Human Rights and Finance.
6102, an act establishing a national high school in Barangay Lingunan, Valenzuela City, to be known as Lingunan National High School, and appropriating funds therefore. 6104, an act converting the Licop Elementary School in Barangay Licop, Mati City, province of Davao Oriental, into an integrated school to be known as Licop Integrated School, and appropriating funds therefore.
To the Committees on Education, Arts and Culture and Finance.
6114, an act increasing the bed capacity of the Luis Hora Memorial Regional Hospital from 100 to 200 beds, upgrading the service facilities and professional health care therein, and appropriating funds therefore.
To the Committees on Health and Demography and Finance.
6129, an act establishing the Lanao del Norte Sports Training Center to be located in the municipality of Tubod, province of Lanao del Norte, and appropriating funds therefore. 6130, an act establishing the Sarangani Sports Training Center in the municipality of Palabel, province of Sarangani, and appropriating funds therefore. An act converting the Caloocan City Extension Office of the Land Transportation Office, located in Malabon City, Metro Manila, into a regular LTO district office, and appropriating funds therefore. 6155, an act converting the Land Transportation Office Extension Office located in Lapu-Lapu City, province of Cebu, into a regular LTO district office, and appropriating funds therefore.
To the Committees on Public Services and Finance.
Letter from the House of Representatives informing the Senate that on 23 August 2017 it concurred with the Senate amendments to the following House bills. 2924, an act creating a barangay to be known as Barangay Cristo Rey in the municipality of Capas, province of Tarlac. 4925, an act dividing the one barangay municipality of Dumalneg in the province of Ilocos Norte into 3 distinct and independent barangays to be known as Barangay Calao, Barangay Cabaritan, and Barangay Cuibel.
To the Archives.
Bills on first reading, 1575, an act increasing the age of an act increasing the age for determining a statutory rate to provide stronger protection for children, and amending for this purpose Act number 3815 is amended, also known as the Revised Penal Code. Senator Win Gatchalian.
To the Committees on Justice and Human Rights and Women, Children, and Family Relations and Gender Equality.
1576, an act mandating the use of on-body cameras by law enforcement officers during any anti-illegal drug and criminality operations, and providing funds. Therefore, Senator Win Gatchalian.
To the Committees on Public Order and Dangerous Drugs and Finance.
Resolutions. 482, a resolution directing the appropriate Senate committee to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the Commission on Audit discovery of a 25 billion peso discrepancy on the recording of the remittances and releases from the Malampaya Natural Gas Project, with the end in view of reconciling all books of accounts pertaining to the Malampaya Fund and to determine the actual balance of the said fund. Senator Recto.
To the Committees on Finance and Energy.
483, a resolution commending and congratulating the Philippine contingent to the 29th Southeast Asian Games in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, for winning a total of 24 gold, 33 silver, and 64 bronze medals. Senator Emmanuel Manny Pacquiao.
To the Committee on Rules.
484 is a resolution commending and congratulating the outstanding Filipinos of 2017 awarded by the Metro Bank Foundation, Senator Emmanuel Manny Pacquiao.
To the Committee on Rules.
485, resolution honoring and commending the Metro Bank Foundation outstanding Filipinos of 2017, Senator Honasan II.
To the Committee on Rules.
486, resolution honoring and commending the 2017 Metro Bank Foundation outstanding Filipinos for their professional excellence, extraordinary dedication and contribution to the nation, Senator Ligarda.
To the Committee on Rules.
487, a resolution directing the appropriate committee to conduct an assessment and evaluation in aid of legislation into the performance of the Philippine contingent to the recently concluded 29th Southeast Asian Games in Malaysia for the purpose of determining what appropriate action can be done to improve our preparations for the international competitions and for other possible remedial actions, Senator Emmanuel Manny Pacquiao.
To the Committee on Sports. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, yesterday was the birthday of the daughter of my favorite friend. It's the birthday of Senator Grace Poe, so I move to suspend the session so that we may be able to greet her a very happy birthday.
Session is suspended. Stop mo na yung ano. Diyan pagka-resume namin. Stop na. Sa journal.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Okay, session is resumed.
Mr. President, to speak on a matter of public interest, may we recognize Senator Risa Ontiveros.
Senator Ontiveros is recognized to speak on a matter of public interest. The chair requests for total silence, please, as we listen to Senator Ontiveros.
Salamat po, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise on a point of personal and collective privilege. On August 30th, we marked the International Day of the Disappeared, and the advocates from the Asian Federation Against Involuntary Disappearance, or AFAD, and the families of victims of involuntary disappearances or fined are here with us today. The International Day of the Disappeared, Mr. President, a day when we come together to remember those who have been victims of enforced disappearances, either by despotic governments or by non-state armed groups. The Spanish word for it is desaparecidos, and Latin American history is rife with accounts of those who have been disappeared and kept outside the mantle of protection of the law. In the Philippines, enforced disappearance was a key weapon of choice of the dictator Ferdinand Marcos, whose martial law resulted in the deaths and disappearances of thousands of Filipinos, many of them young people. According to documented reports, some 2,300 individuals still remain missing in the Philippines since the declaration of martial law in the 1970s until around 2016. Hanggang ngayon, Mr. President, ang 2,300 taong ito ay hindi pa nabibigyan ng maayos na paglibing o hindi pa naibabalik ng buhay sa kanilang mga pamilya. At hanggang ngayon ay patuloy pa din ang pangungulila at pagtatanong ng kanilang mga mahal sa buhay. Isa na po dito si Ronald John Kimpo. John sa mga nagmamahal sa kanya. Nang huling mga salitang iniwan sa kanyang ate na si Susan ay pagtirhan siya ng ulam. Hanggang ngayon, nangungulila pa din ang kanyang pamilya. Buti pa si Marcos may bangkay, ang sabi ni Susan, sa kasagsagan ng mga debate hinggil sa pagpapalibing kay Marcos sa libingan ng mga bayani. Incidentally, Mr. President, on Monday, we celebrated National Heroes Day. Silang mga desaparecido ay kasama sa mga tunay na bayani, hindi ang diktador na pumaslang sa kanila na ngayon nakahimlay kasama ng mga magigiting na Pilipino. Mr. Marcos's callous disregard for civil liberties and human rights plunged this country into 2 decades of darkness, and its effects are still felt to this day. And yet, Mr. President, it seems that we haven't learned the lessons of history. We commemorate the International Day of the Disappeared this year, 2017, under a similar specter of darkness. A few months ago, the Commission on Human Rights revealed a secret detention center holding 12 people in a police station in Manila, right at the heart of the capital. In the past 2 weeks, the whole nation bore horrifying witness to the more than 80 killings in Caloocan, Batangas, and Manila at the hands of policemen, all of which are part of the many thousands of deaths under the President's war on drugs. Kasama na dito si Kian, whose murder was clearly part of the design of the reprehensible Oplan Tokhang. Ang tumawag kay Kian na drug runner, ang nagsabing blown out of proportion ang kaso ni Kian, ang nagsabing gawing state witness ang mga pulis na bumaril sa bata, at higit sa lahat, ang nagsabing papakain sa isda ng Manila Bay ang bangkay ng lahat ng adik. Mr. President, we remember today those who have been disappeared through the years, not only in the Philippines, but all over the world. I especially mention today the Rohingya people, persecuted in Burma and targeted by a vicious military campaign that has resulted in scores of disappearances, including among women and children. And as we remember them, so too do we remember they who have been rendered invisible, they who've been called the dregs of society, they who've been deemed undeserving of second chances, those whose economic and social vulnerabilities have led to more vulnerabilities. We remember those felled in the dark alleys of the city with a cardboard to mark their alleged sins, and the grief of their loved ones unheard in the chambers of power unless sufficient traction is generated in the media and the status quo is shaken. Sa ngalan po ng mga desaparecido, we call on the Philippine government to immediately ratify the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance, or ICPED, as well as strict and full implementation of Republic Act 10353, or the Anti-Enforced or Involuntary Disappearance Act of 2012. But another call remains as urgent, Mr. President. Stop enforced disappearances, close down secret detention centers, and most of all, stop the killing, start the healing. Itigil po ang karumal-dumal na patayan. Simulan po ang hustisya at paghilom. Salamat po, Mr. President.
Hindi ako magtatanong.
Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that we refer the privileged speech of Senator Ontiveros to the Committee on Justice.
Any objection? Hearing none, motion is approved.
Mr. President, Senator Francis Escudero, the chairman of the Committee on Education, will be sponsoring 6 House bills pertaining to the establishments and conversions of local high schools in various parts of the country. Similar to what we have done previously, Senator Escudero will deliver an omnibus sponsorship speech on the measures. However, for purposes of the passage or tackling of the measure on second and third reading, purposes of interpellations, for approvals, we will be taking it up one at a time. So I so move, Mr. President.
Is there any objection to the procedure outlined by the Majority Leader? There being none, the motion or the said procedure is approved.
Thank you. Now, Mr. President, with the permission of the Chamber, I move to transfer from the calendar for ordinary business to the calendar for special orders the following House bills. House Bill 4598 under Committee Report 149, House Bill 5051 under Committee Report 150.
Majority Leader, I have been informed that the bills have been transferred. They're now in the proper calendar.
They're already in the calendar for special orders. Therefore, Mr. President, let me amend my motion. I move to consider House Bill 4598 under Committee Report 149, House Bill 5051 under Committee Report 150, House Bill 5183 under Committee Report 151, House Bill 4524 under Committee Report 152, House Bill 5052 under Committee Report 153, House Bill 4599 under Committee Report 154.
The motion is to consider. Any
Yes.
objection? Hearing none, motion is approved.
May we now ask the Secretary to read the short title of the measures?
Secretary, please read the short title of the 6 House bills.
House Bill number 4598, an act establishing a National Technical Vocational High School in Barangay Nasisi, City of Ligao, Province of Albay, to be known as Ligao City National Technical Vocational High School and appropriating funds therefore. House Bill number 5051, an act establishing a National Science and Mathematics High School in Barangay Hulong Dagat, City of Malabon, to be known as Malabon City National Science and Mathematics High School and appropriating funds therefore. House Bill number 5183, an act establishing a national high school in Barangay Hampangan, Municipality of Hilongos, Province of Leyte, to be known as Hampangan National High School and appropriating funds therefore. House Bill number 4524, an act converting the San Rafael National High School in the city of Navotas into a National Technical Vocational High School to be known as San Rafael Technological and Vocational High School and appropriating funds, therefore, House Bill number 5052, an act establishing a national high school in Barangay Banahaw, City of Baybay, Province of Leyte, to be known as Banahaw National High School, and appropriating funds, therefore, House Bill number 4599, an act establishing a national high school in the city of Pagadian, Province of Zamboanga del Sur, to be known as Pagadian City Science High School, and appropriating funds, therefore.
Mr. President, to sponsor the measure, may we ask the Chairman of the Committee on Education, Senator Francis Chis Escudero, be recognized.
Senator Escudero is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, we will over-comply. May we ask, in addition to our sponsorship speech for all the 6 bills, may we ask for the record that our individual sponsorship speech for each bill be inserted into the records, together with the explanatory note of the original House bills, which we have included in the record as well. However, for the record, may I deliver a short omnibus sponsorship speech for all 6 bills. Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, these measures seek to establish secondary schools that will not only provide better quality education, which is free and more accessible to all, but will help ensure better career opportunities in the future. Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, the establishment of the National Tech-Voc High Schools, namely in Ligao and in San Rafael, aim to provide our constituency, especially the youth, with opportunities to develop and improve their skills, ingenuity, and technological know-how by offering them relevant specializations and vocations. As it is our constitutional duty to make secondary education accessible to our students, I also seek your support for the establishment of a national high school in Hampangan and in Banahaw, both in the province of Leyte. In these parts of our country, Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, our students have to walk 7 to 10 kilometers, mostly through rough and mountainous roads, just to get to the nearest secondary school. Therefore, the establishment of these high schools shall greatly benefit the students residing in those municipalities. Lastly, Mr. President, the establishment of a National Science and Mathematics High School, both in Malabon City and Pagadian City, is in line with DepEd's thrust to establish national science high schools throughout the country to provide our brightest students in these areas with more intensive and advanced secondary education program, and subsequently provide them with better career opportunities in the field of science, mathematics, and technology. Thank you, Mr. President. We submit.
Mr. President, to give time to the senators, to the other senators to study the proposed measure, I move to suspend consideration of House Bills 4598, 5051, 5183, 4524, 5052, 4599.
Senator Drilon is recognized.
Parliamentary inquiry before the chair acts on the motion of the majority leader. Mr. President, do we have the explanatory note on each of these bills? Because the last time there was none. We did not object to the common sponsorship on the understanding that there are explanatory notes for each of these bills. That's our inquiry, Mr. President.
Senator Escudero.
Mr. President, we have it as I requested it be inserted together with my sponsorship speech, which we have also with us. We will be submitting them right after the motion is acted upon.
So as I understand it, we had a common sponsorship speech. We have individual sponsorship speeches plus explanatory notes.
Yes, Mr. President.
This was
Three.
three. That's correct. That's how I understood it.
There were no individual sponsorship speeches. That's
to
an
be-
omnibus and the explanatory notes.
Mr. President,
to be inserted.
may I clarify? Before I delivered my omnibus sponsorship speech, I requested that the individual sponsorship speech be inserted into the records, together with the explanatory
Yes, he said
note.
that. He said that. Plus the explanatory. That's very clear. So I correctly understood what
Yes,
you said. Thank
that
you.
is correct, Mr.
So
President.
the motion, the pending motion now is to suspend consideration.
Yes,
Any objection? Hearing none, motion is approved.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have 4 measures to tackle, but before we start the interpellations, I move that we suspend the session for a few minutes.
Tinatlo ko na nga.
Session is suspended.
Individual at omnibus. Binasa ko na yung omnibus.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, with the permission of the Chamber, I move to resume consideration of Senate Bill 1483 under Committee Report 117.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
This is the Fiscal and Monetary Report Act of 2017. The parliamentary status of the measure is that we're now in the period of interpellations. So may we recognize the sponsor, Chairman of the Committee on Economic Affairs, Senator Win Gatchalian.
Senator Gatchalian is recognized.
Scheduled to interpellate is Senator Pacquiao and myself, Mr. President. So I do not see Senator Pacquiao in the chamber, so may I be recognized to continue with the period of interpellation.
The Majority Leader is recognized for interpellation.
Mr. President, will the distinguished gentleman from Valenzuela favor us with answers to some questions that will enlighten us on the intent of the bill, Mr. President?
I'll be more than happy to answer some queries, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. So let me start by asking, is it accurate to state that one of the purposes of this bill is to obtain information in pursuit of our oversight functions, or in other words, to be informed on how these department heads implement the laws that we issue?
Both, Mr. President. Actually, right now, some of the reports prescribed under the law are being published in their website, and in fact, they also send the Senate reports of these fiscal and monetary policies. However, what is lacking, Mr. President, is interaction with these department heads. So we don't have any opportunity to inquire as to why these type of policies are being implemented and what is the impact of these policies being implemented. Their action can be used for legislation and to craft laws that will ultimately enhance the policies that they prescribed.
So, do I hear it right? You said both.
Both, Mr.
Both,
President.
yes and
Both
no.
to-
Yes and no. Therefore, so the purpose of mandating this department heads to appear before us,
is to obtain information also, and as well as to have physical interaction with the executive secretaries.
well then, isn't this akin to the question hour, which is provided for in our Constitution? Practically the same purpose, achieve the same thing.
The objective, Mr. President, is quite similar. However, question hour is on a need-to basis. This will ultimately institutionalize and mandate the secretaries to come to the Senate and brief the senators on their monetary and fiscal strategies. So this will, the law prescribes twice a year of physical appearance to the Senate. So it's an institutionalization of fiscal reporting.
Well, let me go directly to the bill first before I go to the issue on question hour or relative to the question hour, no? Because in the title of your bill, you use the word mandating as regards to the appearance of the head of the Department of Finance, Department of Budget and Management, the NEDA, and the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas.
Yes, Mr. President.
So also in Section 3, line 11, the word shall was used regarding the appearance of the said head of agencies before Congress. In this regard, Mr. President, the objective of your bill is to require such attendance,
Yes,
and
Mr.
not
President.
merely requesting, no?
Yes, Mr.
That's
President.
how it is?
To
All right.
compel them to attend physically the briefings.
No, okay. So in that case, Mr. President, and if this is akin to a question hour, but the terms of their appearance is mandatory,
Yes.
like you said, you know.
Mr. President.
Is this not in contrast with what is provided for in our Constitution? Like, no, as far as I know, Mr. President, there is a big difference between inviting heads of departments in aid of legislation and inviting them for question hour.
This is
Only in aid of legislation can we mandate their appearance before us, except if they validly claim their executive privileged for confidential information and internal deliberation with the President. Now, here the purpose of the appearance is parallel to the question hour. Thus, in observance with the doctrine of separation of powers, Congress may only request for their appearance, and they in turn can appear with the consent of the President. Mr. President, may I call your attention to, and then I will get the reaction of the distinguished gentleman. I call your attention to Article 6, Section 22 of the 1987 Constitution. It reads, the heads of departments may, emphasis on the word may used by the Constitution, upon their own initiative, with the consent of the President, or upon the request of either House, request, Mr. President, as the rules of each House shall provide, appear before and be heard by such House on any matter pertaining to their departments. Written questions shall be submitted to the President of the Senate or Speaker of the House of Representatives at least 3 days before their scheduled appearance. Interpellations shall not be limited to written questions, but may cover matters related thereto. When the security of the state or the public interest so requires, and the President so states in writing, the appearance shall be conducted in executive session. Now, I also invite the attention of the body to Executive Order 464, Section 1, appearance by heads of departments before Congress. In accordance with Article 6, Section 22 of the Constitution, and to implement the constitutional provisions on the separation of powers between co-equal branches of the government, all heads of departments of the executive branch of the government shall secure the consent of the President prior to appearing before either House of Congress. When the security of the state or the public interest so requires, and the President so states in writing, the appearance shall only be conducted in executive session. That is, Mr. President, end of quote. That is the point I was trying to raise, Mr. President, that there's a big difference between mandating and requesting. And what we want to do with this bill is contrary to what Article 6 states, Mr. President. May we hear your thoughts on that, Mr. President?
Mr. President, it is also in our view that in Section 21, Congress can compel department secretaries to attend Senate inquiries in aid of legislation with an end in view of crafting legislation pertaining to that in aid of legislation. It is our view that requiring the secretaries to attend twice a year, mandating them to attend twice a year, will ultimately lead to crafting of legislation, such as the budget, which is actually a legislative process. So by mandating these secretaries to attend, we will have a clear view on their monetary and fiscal policies, and ultimately it will help the senators and Congress to craft legislation supporting or maybe denying those policies. At the end, it also will enable the Senate to debate and to craft the budget with more accurately.
But based on your first answer to my first question, you said you agreed that it is to obtain information.
And also to create laws, Mr. President.
Well,
See-
so you no longer intend to require a joint session when these heads of departments appear to present their reports, is that correct?
Mr. President, there are other suggestions that to call this a joint oversight instead of a joint session.
Not
A joint
you said-
oversight, a
Oh.
joint oversight committee instead of a joint session. No? And
Oh.
and we are open also to how to define and how to identify the members of this joint oversight committee. It is recommended, and maybe on a later date, Mr. President, I will be proposing amendments to that effect.
Well, okay, in that case, because I was going to that, a joint congressional oversight committee, no, is would be best
Yes.
instead of
Yes.
so that this will be better
Mi-
delivered, Mr.
Mis-
President.
Mr. President, just to continue the discussion on compelling the secretaries to attend, ultimately, when these secretaries attend these briefings and explains to the senators their fiscal and monetary policies, it actually addresses multiple objectives. Number one is to obtain information. Number two, to have interaction, direct interaction with the secretaries. And number three, to craft legislation to support the policies or revoke the policies. At the end of the year, we also craft one of the most important legislations of the country, which is the budget. And these policies actually impact positively and negatively the budget. So this is in line with Article 6, Section 21 of the Constitution, in where, in aid of legislation, we can actually compel the secretaries to come to the Senate and discuss monetary and fiscal strategies.
Then again, well, I would be very cautious in using the word compel because it does not say so in the Constitution, Mr. President. Anyway, I'm done with my questions, Mr. President. We'll probably wait until the period of amendments. In the meantime, I move that we recognize Senator Manny Pacquiao.
Thank you,
to
Mr.
continue
President.
with the interpellations.
Senator Pacquiao is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Will the good Senator from Valenzuela yield a few questions?
Yes, I'll be more than happy to receive some questions, Mr. President.
Dito sa Section 3, Mr. President, kung update lamang po ng fiscal and monetary policies ang kailangan natin, why would we need still to conduct a full-blown hearing?
Actually, Mr. President, this is more akin to a briefing of monetary and fiscal strategies and policies of the economic managers. If we look at the composition of the people required to come to the Senate, they are all connected to the economy of the country or the economic policies of the country. So I think the briefing is very vital, very important in terms of updating also the senators and Congress. But ultimately, we will use the information to craft laws.
Why we do need to oblige the heads of the different departments to appear here in Congress when we can simply ask them to submit a comprehensive report?
Yes. Mr. President, right now there are 4 different laws. I'll just, with the kind indulgence of the gentleman from Sarangani, let me just flash slide number 4, slide number 2, sorry. There are 4 laws and issuance concerning fiscal responsibilities. These laws and issuances actually mandate the various economic departments or economic-related departments to publish economic reports, fiscal and monetary policies alike. However, none of the issuance and the policies mandate them to come here and explain and brief us in depth. So there is no way for the centers to interact with them and get explanations as to what are the impacts of this strategy. It's only until the DBCC is convened at the end of the year for budget purposes, then we have direct interaction with the economic managers. With this law, actually, it mandates them twice a year to come here. So the reports they submit to us on a monthly, on a quarterly basis will be explained thoroughly, physically and directly to the senators.
Thank you. In Executive Order 464, in some cases, the Supreme Court ruled that the communications between the President and members of his cabinet may fall under privileged information. How can we fully implement this law in case the answer to our queries fall under privileged information?
Okay. Let me just flash the slide number 12, again with the kind indulgence of the senator from Sarangani. Invoking executive privilege have limitations also, as decided upon by the Supreme Court. And the limitations are, number one, state secrets regarding military, diplomatic, and other national security matters. And number two, presidential conversations, correspondence, and discussions in closed-door cabinet meetings. As I mentioned before, all of these reports are already being published in the website. And unless those economic reports are somehow connected to these two expressly stated reasons, then there is no reason for the economic managers to invoke executive privilege.
Thank you. Paano po kung pigilan ng Presidente ang appearance ng mga secretaries sa Congress o gaya ng Executive Order 464 ni President Jaime na partially valid, sabi ng Supreme Court na kailangan lamang mag-secure ng prior consent ng President?
Right. As I mentioned before, a lot of the required reports under the bill, under the proposed bill, are already being published in their website and being sent to Congress and the Senate. However, if the President will not allow them and invoke executive privilege, again, it should fall under the two categories as expressly promulgated, expressly stated by the Supreme Court. This is under the Neri versus the Senate Committee case under GR number 180643. So it has to be within the context of state secrets and presidential conversations, correspondence, and discussed in closed-door cabinet meetings.
And in the end, we just want to know our economic standing. Hindi pa ba pwedeng nida na lamang ang regular na kumbidahin para mag-attend ng hearing?
The bill actually strengthens public accountability, Mr. President, meaning by physically attending and interacting with the legislators, it improves the public accountability of our good secretaries. It also enhances good governance within the government system. I think what is quite important here, Mr. President, is to really go deeper into the issues by interacting with the economic managers. The reports paint one picture. The published reports paint a one-sided picture, but interacting, going deeper into the problems, going deeper into the reports, knowing exactly the impact after these policies are being made is very important, and these are not expressly written in the reports. I think the bill also improves transparency and accountability among government officials.
Thank you, Mr. President. Will this proposed measure in effect amend our Constitution, considering our Constitution mentioned joint session of Congress only twice, martial law and comedic elections?
Yes. Mr. President, I do admit that some of the terminologies need to be improved, and there are suggestions from the good majority floor leader and also some of our members to, instead of naming it as joint hearings, it will be a joint oversight committee or joint oversight council. And members of both economic clusters of the House and the Senate will be part of that joint oversight committee or council.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I hope that the gentleman from Valenzuela will accept our amendments and period of amendments.
Definitely, Mr. President, we're open to improving the bill. We're open to making the bill a more accurate and reflective bill.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Majority Leader, a few questions from the chair, if the sponsor doesn't mind. When the head of the Federal Reserve of the United States appears before the U.S. Congress, it's a highly publicized event. Is that mandatory also?
Yes,
In accordance with law?
Yes, Mr. President. In fact, let me just name some of the countries we're in. There is mandatory appearance of the BSP, the central bank governor. In the United States, under Section 2B of the Federal Reserve Act of the United States, the chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System is required to appear semi-annually before the U.S. Congress and semi-annual hearings. In Singapore, it's also the same. In Indonesia, they also have the same laws that require the economic managers, in particular the central bank governor, to appear before Congress and Senate.
In the earlier interpellations, the Majority Leader mentioned some constitutional provisions. This would not be applicable to the BSP governor.
This is applicable to the BSP
No, the potential constitutional issue concerning question hour,
Yes.
etc. This only involves the heads of the departments, but not the BSP governor.
In the proposal, Mr. President, in the measure, it's the Secretary of Finance.
No, meaning to say, even if we entertain, let us say there is some constitutional issue regarding this measure, that should only involve the heads of the departments, but not the BSP governor. Meaning to say, we can save this measure as far as the BSP governor is concerned. Assuming that there is a constitutional issue.
Yes, most
Okay,
likely, Mr. President. No.
So there would be no constitutional issue on mandating the appearance of the BSP governor before Congress twice a year.
Yes, Mr. President.
Most likely that would be the case. No? Okay, so in the United States, it is only the head of the Federal Reserve who is mandated to appear. Not there. Do they have also economic planning secretaries and finance secretary?
In the Federal Reserve Act of the United States, it's the chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, equivalent to our central bank
Yes,
governor,
yes.
Mr. President.
There is no equivalent law in the U.S. concerning secretaries of departments appearing before their Congress.
Not that I know of, Mr. President.
So that would be the Philippine innovation.
However, let me just point out, in Indonesia, in Singapore, it's the minister in charge of the Monetary Authority of Singapore is accountable to the Parliament. And the Monetary Authority is probably equivalent also to our central bank governor.
I think in the parliamentary system, the rules are entirely different. So that would be all. Thank you,
Thank you, Mr.
Sponsor,
President.
for accommodating my questions.
Thank you, Mr. President. There being no further interpellations, I move to close the period of interpellations.
Senator Dillon will no longer interpolate.
He has already interpolated, Mr.
Okay,
President.
thank you. So the motion is to close the period for interpolation. Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
Some of our colleagues are preparing for the period of amendments, Mr. President, so I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill 1483.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
Mr. President, with the permission of the Chamber, I move to resume consideration of Senate Bill 1252 under Committee Report 99.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
This is the measure on the Anti-Rape Act. The parliamentary status of the measure is that we're in the period of interpellation. So may we recognize the sponsor, Chairman of the Committee on Women, Children, Family Relations, and Gender Equality, Senator Risa Ontiveros, and to interpellate yours truly and Senator Pacquiao, but he has already opted to do his interpellation in another date, Mr. President. So may I be recognized to interpellate, Mr.
The
President?
sponsor, Senator Ontiveros, and the Majority Leader are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, will the distinguished lady from Akbayan answer a few questions, Mr. President?
Very gladly, Mr. President.
Mr. President, we of course support the intention of the bill because the original Republic Act 8353, which we passed in 1997, this representation was very active in the interpellations and also became a co-author of the measure, Mr. President. And this is the original expanded rape bill, just to set the record straight, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Now, with all due respect to the sponsor, and as I mentioned, I'm sure you know that I am very familiar with the old or the current anti-rape law. I find some of the provisions of this measure superfluous, as most of them are already contained in the existing laws as well as jurisprudences that are already part of the law of the land. So may I know from the sponsor the rationale why the phrase, or why the lack of consent, I should say, is being emphasized on this proposed measure when it has already been ruled by the Supreme Court time and again that the main element of the crime of rape is lack of consent.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I appreciate the question of the good gentleman because it in fact points out to the first main difference of this bill with the existing law, that the issue of absence of consent is emphasized as the essential element of the crime of rape. The bill explicitly introduces the phrase "without consent" in the definition of rape and uses it repeatedly in the provisions that describe how rape is committed. As the good gentleman pointed out, yes, it is true that absence of consent is already an element of rape under existing law, but importantly, Mr. President, the phrase "without consent" is not written into the actual statute. Instead, the statute makes use of terms like force, threat, or intimidation, deprived of reason or otherwise unconscious, or fraudulent machination and grave abuse of authority, all of which are more reliant on externally based evidence than on the mindset and perspective of the victim. What we would like to address here, Mr. President, is the perpetuation of rape myths, which have been prevalent in Supreme Court decisions on rape. For example, that, quote, "resistant must be manifested and tenacious. A mere attempt to resist is not the resistance required and expected of a woman defending her virtue, honor, and chastity." And most recently, Mr. President, in February, just this year, the Supreme Court ruled against another rape victim. According to her testimony, she fell asleep from dizziness while drinking alcohol with the accused and another friend, and was roused from her sleep when she felt the friend having sex with her. She was afraid that a knife in plain view would be used to kill if she resisted. When the friend had left, the accused approached her to ask if they could also have sex. And as she could not respond because she was shivering from fright and dizzy from the alcohol, he proceeded to rape her too. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the accused because the victim, quote, chose not to utter a word, close quote. The Supreme Court even said that while the victim, quote, feared for her life since a knife lying on the table nearby could be utilized to kill her if she resisted, her fear was a mere product of her own imagination, close quote. Because of jurisprudence like this, Mr. President, referring to the current law, we have found it necessary in the bill to make explicit the phrase without consent repeatedly to define and describe how the crime of rape is committed. So putting, Mr. President, the issue of absence of consent front and center of the crime of rape, Mr. President.
Mr. President, there could be, can we have a copy of that decision?
Yes,
Because
Mr.
there
President.
could be other issues in that particular case. It cannot be the general rule because, Mr. President, without the term lack of consent in the law already, it will not change the crime. Now, one of the main sources of law in the Philippines is judicial decisions. And accordingly, these judicial decisions form part of the legal system of the Philippines. Thus, applying the same in this case, the rule that the main element of the crime of rape is lack of consent is already a law. So, parang nagiging redundant lang tayo sa pagsisingit natin dito sa dating batas ng mga pag-insert nitong phrase na to because as I said, baka yung case na sinasite nila ay meron mga ibang sitwasyon at hindi lang that particular, hindi basta gagano ng Supreme Court only because of that. There must be other issues in that particular. So please submit to us a copy also of that particular decision of the Supreme Court.
I will gladly do so, Mr. President, copies of both decisions to further demonstrate that the main argument on which the decisions were rendered was this supposed absence of the lack of consent, but which the bill seeks to enhance the definition of the crime of rape, and which by repeatedly referring or introducing the phrase without consent to describe how the crime of rape is committed. And further, Mr. President, and perhaps this will come up also later in the interpellation, there are also various psychological studies which will give further credence to the various ways in which absence of consent is within a woman or even in a man who is being subjected to the crime of rape. Various reactions that may be demonstrated or manifested by victims of this most intimate of violence, this situation of overwhelming helplessness or powerlessness.
Karen, sa revised penal code kasi, Mr. President, Article 266, it is incorporated in the current law. Ang mga when and how committed rape through force, threat, intimidation when the offended party is deprived of reason or otherwise unconscious by means of fraudulent machinations or grave abuse of authority. Lahat ito no consent obvious na no consent. That's why anyway, Mr. President, I understand that the reason of the distinguished lady, but I feel it redundant. Now,
Mr. President, often we say that what is made explicit in the law is actually what is the law and what jurisprudence can be based upon. Nowhere in Article 266A, whether in Section 1, letter A, number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, is it explicit yet this matter of the absence of consent. And that is why the proposed amendment in this bill introduces in each of these sections the phrase without the latter's consent, or without her consent, or without the person's consent, to make explicit that we are not only to base our understanding of the crime of rape on external evidence from the perspective of the aggressor or observers to the crime, but from the victim's experience herself. May I also cite that in the case of Karen Vertido, the Supreme Court found against her because allegedly she did not resist. But in that decision, the Philippines was found to be violating the CEDAW, or the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, Mr. President.
If you will look closely at the current law, the incorporation of Article 266 of the Revised Penal Code and defining rape, A, B, C, and D defines lack of consent, and that is already also in the in the decisions of the Supreme Court, Mr. President. That's why, well, it is my opinion that it is redundant. If it is not, as far as the distinguished lady is concerned, you want to incorporate that, we will probably discuss it further later on in the period of amendments.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the good gentleman's openness, because in fact, when we do review the writing of Article 266A, rape when and how committed, rape is committed, all the phrases read, for example, number 1, by a man who shall have carnal knowledge of a woman under any of the following circumstances, and so on. None of the phrases, including explicitly the phrase without the latter's consent. Also, Mr. President, the bill seeks to make explicit the lack of consent, including in the language, and not just the spirit of the law, but the language of the law, because otherwise it would continue to not cover the universe of experiences of rape victims, including the various ways, psychological, emotional, even physical responses that rape victims may manifest during the commission of the crime, Mr. President.
Nevertheless, Mr. President, I feel that Republic Act 8353 is complete with that. No? It's not necessary. Ganun talaga pagka pagka kasama ka sa original laws, tapos may mga pinapasok na bago na nandun naman, hindi ba? Ang attitude mo, bakit? Bakit? May masama ba sa batas namin? May hindi ba matino doon? Ganun eh. Anyway,
wala pong masama, Mr. President. Mayroong pagkukulang siguro na nakita nitong nakaraang ilang mga taon ng pag-aplika ng batas. At dahil naman yung legislation ay isang continuing process of further and further refinement, building on previous good laws like the current law, kaya po ay minabuti po naming i-draft po itong kasalukuyang panukalang batas, Mr. President.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, but, well, basta, Mr. President, the definitions that are related there are definitely lack of consent. That's as far as I can do. May we recognize the minority leader, Mr. President?
Senator Drilon, with the
With the
permission.
permission of our colleagues on the floor, may we know if there is a change in the elements in the crime of rape in the present law and in the proposed law?
Yes, Mr. President, and there are three main differences. One is the issue of absence of consent is emphasized as the essential element of the crime of rape. Secondly, Mr. President, the bill seeks to raise the age of sexual consent from below 12 years old to below 18 years old, therefore impacting on the crime of statutory rape. And third, Mr. President, it expands those who can commit rape with carnal knowledge, referring not only to men, but to persons. Because as of now, under the existing law, Mr. President, when rape is committed with carnal knowledge, the only possible perpetrator can be a man, and the only possible victim a woman. This
I'm
bill...
just interested
Yes,
in the
Mr.
first
President.
set of differences that the gentle lady has enumerated.
Yes, Mr. President.
just on that issue, and I may have other questions on the other parts of the bill, but just on that issue, this is a bill which, if becomes law, is favorable to the accused or to the one convicted. Now, if Mr. A was convicted of rape and there was, I'm sorry, I take that back. The phrase "without the latter's consent" is a new element. Is that what the lady is saying?
It is a new emphasis, Mr. President.
No.
There is no
Element.
change
I'm talking
in the
about
basic
element, not emphasis.
Yes, Mr.
Because
President.
when we prosecute a crime, you talk about elements. We want to know whether it is the intention to introduce a new element, because emphasis is not an element in the prosecution of a crime. It is the elements of the crime. So I think what we should put into the record is this a new element being introduced?
This is not a new element, Mr. President, not a change in the basic elements of rape, just an
Okay.
emphasis on consent.
Now,
Yes, Mr.
because that goes into the question of the majority leader. If it does not change any element, it's just emphasis. So the lack of the vitiated consent or the lack of consent is still an element. It doesn't change anything.
It
that
is
a correct
part of the
statement?
basic element of rape, Mr. President, with emphasis on that aspect of consent.
Well, you know, the emphasis is a criminal statute, and the emphasis, the use of the word emphasis can confuse the prosecutor and the judge and the
So
defense counsel.
if it's emphasis, can we say that it's a matter of style? So we're just styling the law?
I do not know.
Yes.
If it is just emphasis,
Mr. President, this amendment would accommodate other instances where consent is denied.
or cons- maybe we should allow the majority leader to
We thank
continue
the
with this.
minority leader,
with this,
Mr. President,
revelation.
for bringing that out, because I was discussing it with Senator Sari Angara, who is another lawyer, and he feels that, correct, criminal law is very strict.
Yes, that's correct.
Kaya tayo nag-iingat dito. Elements are
We must be
one being
scientific in
discussed,
our
not-
approach,
yes,
yes.
not emphasis. Let me move on now. In the proposed measure, Mr. President, rape is committed, quote, by a man who touches or inserts his penis into the female's inner or outer vaginal labia without her consent, whether or not the woman suffers injuries. This, Mr. President, again, has already been an established jurisprudence, therefore part of the law of the land. Furthermore, Mr. President, in the People versus Kampuhan, the Supreme Court qualified the act of touching by ruling that, quote, the act of touching should be understood here as inherently part of the entry of the penis into the labias of the female organ and not mere touching alone of the mons pubis or the pudendum. However, in this proposed bill that we are tackling, we provided, or there is no qualification. The proposed measure provided no qualification as to the act of touching. Therefore, just the mere insertion of the word touching might be abused. Touching, kung hinipo ko yung braso, touching yun. So I think we should qualify this. Can the sponsor give us the real intention in including this provision in this bill, considering that it is already the law and it may be subject of abuse?
Mr. President, as with any law that the Congress has passed or any proposed law that we are considering, certainly the intent is not to provide for anyone to abuse anyone else's right. And in fact, in laws such as this, an anti-rape law, and a proposed amendment to the law, we seek to provide more effective protection to women and other possible victims of rape. If the good gentleman will look at the bill's Section 1, letter A, number 4, there is, for example, by a person who touches or inserts any instrument or body part or object into the genital or anal orifice of another person without the latter's consent. So yes, touching without the consent of a person, of his or her body, his or her intimate organs without consent.
Did you say
is part-
body or?
The genital or anal orifice.
No, you said earlier, when you touch the body,
Yes, the
That is
sexual part
considered
of a
rape?
sexual part of a person's body, Mr. President.
the
So
sexual part of the person's body.
Yes, so
you-
the sexual
okay.
organs of the person using any instrument or body part or object, because that violates the bodily integrity of the person.
No,
And
Mr. President.
that is that is part of Article 266A, Section 1, even now, and which we seek to make explicit the emphasis on without consent. The penis may touch the vagina without insertion, meaning no full insertion or partial insertion. But touching, yes, under this, under the law and under the proposed amendment, would constitute the crime of rape because there is the absence of consent. Additionally, Mr. President, the present law enumerates force, threat, or intimidation, the unconscious status of the victim, fraudulent machination, but there are more cases of non-consensual sex not yet covered by these circumstances, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I'm merely asking the sponsor to elaborate more on the content of the proposed bill. But here, her explanation is like explaining to me the acts of lasciviousness. It's not what is incorporated in your proposed measure. Now, the reason I'm focusing on this, Mr. President, is because I was about to go to the next point, wherein, on a similar note, Section 1, Paragraph A, Subparagraph 3 and 4 of the subject bill are already included in Republic Act 8353, otherwise known as the Anti-Rape Law of 1997. But before I go there, let me just
But
go
Mr.
back
President,
into
if I may just
yung
interject at that
pag-touch.
phrase,
The explanation you're
Yes.
saying is that
Mr.
when
President.
when a person is touched, the sexual part of the person being touched, yun ang sinasabi nyo. In the present law, if sa rape ang pinag-uusapan, it must be the sexual organ that will touch the sexual organ or the sexual part of the other person.
In fact, Mr.
If you're
President,
touching by the hand, touched by the hand, that's the law on acts of lasciviousness.
Mr. President, I thank the good gentleman for his question because in fact, if you look at Article 266A, Section 1, letter A, number 4, it is included there by a person who touches or inserts any instrument or body part, so presumably even a hand or an object, into the genital or anal orifice of another person. This is already in the...
Where is that? Where is that, Madam Sponsor? What are you reading?
So I correct myself,
Number-
Mr. President.
Yes, I
This
think
is
you
an
should because-
amendment to Article 266A, number 1, letter number 2, It's an amendment to this
Number 2.
section. I propose Article 266A, Section 1, letter A, number 4, to read by a person who touches or inserts any instrument or body part, including, for example, a hand or object, into the genital or anal orifice of another person without the latter's consent. Mr. President.
That would be rape under your bill.
Yes, Mr. President. It
So,
would
Is that clear,
form
Majority
part
Leader?
of the crime of rape.
You're correct,
Mr.
body
President.
part.
You see, Mr.
You're
President.
correct, sir.
Yeah,
Body part.
the existing law, what the distinguished lady is reading into the records, in the existing law, it is already incorporated na shall commit an act of sexual assault by inserting his penis into another person's mouth or anal orifice or any instrument or object into the genital or anal orifice of another person. It's already in the law, in the present law. What the proposed bill is doing is it's dividing it into two, number 3 and number 4 of your proposal. Pero yun din yun yung laman eh. That's my point. Andito, hindi ako kumukontra dito. Gusto ko nga ito eh. Kaya lang, nandun na sa dati.
I thank the good gentleman for his desire to support also this amendment. And I would reiterate that it is not yet present. In fact, as I just corrected myself, Mr. President, it is not yet present in the current law because the current law only speaks of committing an act of sexual assault by inserting his penis into another person's mouth or anal orifice. The bill proposes to include as an amendment by a person who touches or inserts any instrument or body part or object into the genital or anal orifice of another person. So again, Mr. President, it is akin to not only focusing on external evidence on the part of the aggressor inserting his penis into another person's mouth or anal orifice, but is victim-centered. What is the experience of the victim? Which may be that his or her genital or anal orifice is touched or inserted into by an instrument or body part or object without his or her consent, Mr. President.
Of course, it's without her consent. Kaya ho nagiging rape. Dahil if it's with her consent, there's no rape.
I'm sorry,
No matter
Mr.
what
President,
you
I missed
insert.
that. Would the good gentleman please repeat the last, his
Of
last
course,
statement?
it's
I missed
without her consent. Because if it's with her consent or his consent, there's no rape. Even if you put in any instrument or use any instrument.
Which makes my
Siyempre,
point,
talagang
Mr. President.
Talagang it's without her consent para maging rape.
Which is why the assertion in the bill to explicitly include the phrase or phrases without the latter's consent, without her consent, or without the person's consent, Mr. President.
Redundant, Mr. President. It's already there, even in the judicial. Anyway, okay, let's move on. Section 1, paragraph A, subparagraphs 3 and 4 of the subject bill are already included in Republic Act 8353, katulad nung sinabi ko, otherwise known as the Anti-Rape Law of 1997, which states, rape is committed by any person who, under any of the circumstances mentioned in paragraph 1 hereof, shall commit an act of sexual assault by inserting his penis into another person's mouth or anal orifice or any instrument or object into the genital or anal orifice of another person. What is the reason, Mr. President, of the sponsor for reiterating the aforementioned law in this proposed measure? Why don't we leave it as is? Because ito na yun eh. Anyway, it's already included in the existing statute, Mr. President. Why do we have to, parang dinagdagan pa natin eh, kasi ang maganda sa paggawa ng batas, the less words, the better.
That's correct.
Hindi po ba? Yun ang rule of thumb. Kaya yung i-expand natin to, hahabaan natin to, pero ang laman yun din. Why?
Actually, Mr. President, I would agree with the good gentleman that there are some times that less words are better. Less words make a law simpler. Pero po, may mga pagkakataon, tulad dito sa panukalang ito, sa palagay ko lamang po, Mr. President, na kailangan pa natin ng ilang dagdag na salita, ilan pang mga detalye, at ilang pagbibigay ng diin in order to encompass the crime of rape as it has been experienced over the past years, even that we have had the current law. For example, a proposed amendment in the bill is to include body part in new amendment. Body part is not in our current law. And if we are to already recognizing in the current law the use of an instrument or an object inserted into the genital or anal orifice of another person as constituting the crime of rape, all the more so a body part of the person who is accused of rape. Even more intimate than an object is another person's body inside the body of a rape victim, a person who is violated and who has certainly no consent to that crime.
Ano pa ba, Mr. President, ang iba pang body part?
Yung binanggit din po ng good gentleman kanina, kamay, halimbawa,
Penis,
Mr.
fingers,
President.
toes.
Yes, Mr. President.
O nasa batas na yun eh.
Wala pa po yung body part.
Wala na ako ibang alam
Mr.
na body part na
President.
pwedeng i-insert, Mr. President. Ilong.
Mr. President, kanina po sinabi ng good gentleman, kamay.
Eh,
Body part po yan na
No, no,
pwedeng
Mr. President, the
ipasok sa anal or
jurisprudence,
genital orifice
because the
without consent, Mr. President.
Because in the law, it already says any object. In jurisprudence, sinilagay na yan, nandoon na nga sa mga Supreme Court decisions yan. Doon sa any object, kasama na yon.
Mr. President, para po sa akin, ang object ay iba pa po sa parte ng katawan. Pero kung tinatanggap naman ng good gentleman na kasama na sa object yung body part, edi ilagay na po natin para wala na pong pagdududa sa intent ng panukalang
Ang problema
batas,
sa
Mr. President.
paglalagay natin, Mr. President, mas maganda nga yung maluwag eh. Dahil baka may maimbento silang ibang ipapasok eh.
Actually,
Pagka nilimit mo doon sa body part, makukonfine na yan. Baka may madismiss na kaso na naman dyan dahil lang dyan.
Eto pa, Mr.
Samantalang ngayon, presently, mahigpit na eh. Ang ganda nung criminal law natin na 8353. Baka sa kagustuhan natin i-emphasize ito, imbis na element ang idadagdag natin, sabi nga ni Senator Drilon, baka yung emphasis natin, masamantala na magagaling ng mga abogado.
Ito pa, Mr. President, para nga po pati babae pwedeng akusahan o makonvict na ng rape, hindi penis-centered. Itong panukala po, yung amendment.
Kasali din po ang babae.
Yun na nga po, Mr.
Sa
President.
8353.
Pero hindi po. Sa kasalukuyan, penis
kasama.
lamang po. Wala po.
Mr. President, I invite your attention to number 2 of Article 266A. By any person. That means kahit lalaki,
But I
babae,
think,
LGBT.
With the permission of the Majority Leader, the measure under consideration will now equalize the penalty.
Yes, Mr.
Under
President.
existing law, although we say that rape was created by that person, who may be a female, if you look at the existing law, the penalties are different. So under this pending measure, the penalties will now be the same.
Yes, Mr. President.
That's it.
All right,
So,
with that particular,
yes, that's the
okay, so that's the
difference.
that's the reason for that. That's why I asked the sponsor
Tama po, Mr. President.
why we should not just leave it as is, no? It's already included. Okay.
Dahil nga po hindi pa completely included, Mr. President. At para gaya
No,
ng sinabi
it's
ni
included,
Mr.
except that the
President,
penalties are
magiging
different.
mas makatarungan sa lahat, Mr. President.
Now, another proposed amendment that I find repetitive of an already existing law is Section 1, Paragraph B, subparagraphs 1 to 4. Ito sa bill mo. Yan. These are all contained in the current Article 266A of the Revised Penal Code. So may we know the reason for reiterating the aforementioned law in this proposed measure? Section 1, Paragraph B, subparagraph 2, The existing law provides that rape is committed by a man who shall have carnal knowledge of a woman by means of fraudulent machination or grave abuse of authority. In the bill subject for consideration, you deleted the word grave. Why did you delete grave?
Ano yun? Great.
Mr. President, we, in the proposed measure, we propose to retain by a man who shall have carnal knowledge of a woman under any of the following circumstances, through force, threat, or intimidation, when the offended party is deprived of reason or otherwise unconscious, by means of fraudulent machination or abuse of authority. I'll have to review, Mr. President,
Yeah,
if this was an inadvertent deletion of the adjective grave, but we also, well, for one, Mr. President, because in principle abuse of authority is enough, and abuse of authority cannot be qualified or softened by saying it's not a grave abuse or it's a mild abuse, because abuse is abuse. And further, Mr. President, all right. So at this point, Mr. President, this is what I shall say about that. I will check whether we intentionally or inadvertently left out the adjective grave, but even without that adjective, abuse of authority is bad enough, Mr. President.
The current law, may nakasakit ba nun sa grave o wala? Nakasama ba yan? O hindi naman?
If I would be very open to placing back in the text the adjective grave at the proper time,
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. Kung ganon, dahil... Anyway. Section 5, on aggravating circumstances. One of the proposed amendments in your bill is, quote, when the crime is committed by persons of public authority. Mr. President, this is again already provided in Article 14 of the Revised Penal Code as among the aggravating circumstances. So what is the intention of the sponsor in echoing the same provision in this measure?
The intention, Mr. President, is because currently, the current aggravating circumstances include when the victim is under the custody of the police or military authorities or any law enforcement or penal institution. And secondly, Mr. President, when committed by any member of the armed forces of the Philippines or paramilitary units thereof, or the Philippine National Police, or any law enforcement agency or penal institution, when the offender took advantage of his position to facilitate the commission of the crime. The bill introduces as one of the new aggravating circumstances the status of the offender as a person of public or moral authority when such authority is used to perpetrate the act of rape. Because, Mr. President, it may be a person in authority, public authority, may not only be a member of the AFP, PNP, or any of its attached agencies, but others who, by virtue of a public or government mandate, may be in a position of authority or superiority over the victim. And we include further, Mr. President, in the additional or new aggravating circumstance, the status of the offender as a person of moral authority, to including religious leaders who unfortunately and until very recently have figured in news, public knowledge as sexually abusing or raping women or young girls or even young boys, Mr. President.
So you do admit that this is already in the law? I mean, in the jurisprudence, I should say.
It is partially in the law, Mr. President, but limited only to police and military authorities and their attached agencies, but does not cover, as I mentioned, Mr. President, priests, does not cover us politicians, does not cover other persons in public, of public or moral authority over the victims, Mr. President, and whose authority may be used to perpetrate the crime of rape, Mr. President.
Anyway, I believe that it is already covered in the revised penal code. Nevertheless, that is part of what you are reiterating, I should say. No?
Yes, Mr. President. It is
Okay.
not yet explicitly expressed in our current anti-rape law. The anti-rape law is only speaking of AFP and PNP personnel
Oh, but it is
and
existing.
related personnel, but not all persons
lest
of
we
moral
are
and
misunderstood,
public authority, Mr.
it
President.
is existing, Mr. President.
In
Baka
a very
isipin nila,
limited
hindi
fashion,
hindi
Mr.
pa pasok
President.
dahil ipinapasok pa lang natin dito. Hindi, it's already covered in the revised penal code.
It is partially covered, Mr. President, but the bill proposes by amendment to
What is not
expand
covered?
to
If it's
include all
if it's only partial,
persons
Mr.
of
President,
public
what is not
authority,
covered?
Mr. President. What
If you
is-
say that only partial, what is not covered?
What is not covered, Mr. President, would be persons in moral authority over the victim and other public officials outside the AFP, PNP, paramilitary units, law enforcement agencies, and penal institutions, Mr. President.
Well, it depends on the interpretation. It is also in the revised penal code. Nevertheless, another proposal is to include in the aggravating circumstances the following. Ano, dito sa, ano ba section yun? Ayan, section 5, your section 5. When the commission of the crime of rape is proven to have been attended by the offender's hate and prejudice against the victim's sexual orientation and gender identity, race, or religion. Under our criminal law system, Mr. President, what is being punished is the overt act or external acts, either in the preparation or in the execution of a crime. Now, under Article 3 of the revised penal code, felony is defined as acts and omissions punishable by law. All the aggravating circumstances provided in Article 14 of the revised penal code are circumstances that can be proven by overt acts. Examples are crimes committed with insult to public authorities, abuse of confidence, obvious ungratefulness, committed in the palace of the chief executive, and committed in the dwelling of the offended party. These circumstances can be easily determined at the first instance. Now, in your proposed bill, hate and prejudice is not an overt or external act, but rather a feeling or similar to motive. So, under this context, the hate and prejudice described here resulted in an overt act of raping. So, Mr. President, I believe that we cannot include as an aggravating circumstance a mere feeling. So, how can we gauge? My question now to the sponsor is, how can you gauge what is in the mind of a person?
Mr. President, hate and prejudice certainly are not just feelings or motives. They are externalized in very concrete, observable, and provable actions.
Like how?
For example, Mr. President, hatred against a victim's sexual orientation and gender identity could be evidenced by words or actions, even publications, for example, of statements like, i-rape ang lesbian para maging babae. Hate and prejudice against a person's religion could be evidenced by actions, previous actions and words of Islamophobia. If it is a rape of a Muslim person where the aggravating circumstance is this hate and prejudice. So hate and prejudice are not mere feelings or motives, Mr. President, but can have been observable before the commission of the crime of rape and can be proven. And as a matter of fact, Mr. President, hate crime amendments exist already in other jurisdictions where they also know that hate and prejudice are very concrete and externalized. They are lived out and not mere feelings or mere motives, Mr. President.
Mr. President, ang kinakastigo ng korte ay yung krimen, hindi yung motive. How can we determine if this crime or the rape was done because of hate?
Mr. President,
At that particular time. You're talking of, let's say, 1 week ago, somebody was shouting, death to Juan de la Cruz. And then 1 week after, Juan de la Cruz was raped. He's supposed to be the rapist. Would that be the determining factor?
Mr. President, if there is no evidence to show hate or prejudice, then no such aggravating circumstance exists. But if there was or there is evidence to show this hate and prejudice, for example, shouting such hateful language, exhibiting such hate speech, or demonstrating such hateful behavior to a person of a certain race or religion or soji a week ago or however many days ago, then that could be considered as evidence to be tested, whether it proves the crime of rape as an aggravating circumstance, Mr. President. And that is why the bill proposes to include this hate and prejudice as an aggravating circumstance and not merely as a feeling or motive, Mr. President.
I have difficulty trying to accept that particular point. Perhaps, to abbreviate the debate, I will just wait for the period of amendments, Mr. President, because
Thank you, Mr. President.
it is. I don't think we can be able to gauge it, especially the courts, when we are trying already a particular case. And then,
Perhaps, Mr. President, we could learn from the experiences of other countries as well, not just in those jurisdictions which recognize hate or have hate crime legislation, but perhaps also similar historical parallels, like the struggle for civil rights in South Africa. We just had a guest in the gallery earlier, or in states, in some states in the United States, for example, New York, which have hate crime amendments because of their rich and painful and one very costly experiences in backing against apartheid or against hate and prejudice and working for the recognition of their civil rights, Mr. President.
thank you, Mr. President. I will terminate my interpellation and ask that the Minority Leader be recognized, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Minority Leader, can I ask, before I recognize you, can I ask a few questions? Madam Sponsor, regarding Section 5, this will be an insertion of 3 paragraphs in the existing Article 266-B. May I ask where? Where are these supposed to be inserted? As number 11, 12, 13? Or as as among those unnumbered paragraphs?
I would suggest, Mr. President, as an additional 3 aggravating circumstances to the existing list of 10, Mr. President.
Okay,
so numbers
so-
11, 12, and 13, Mr. President.
So this would deserve the gravest penalty, because that is the consequence of the 1 to 10. That's the death penalty, actually. But now, life.
Mr. President, there's no premise yet that these would deserve the gravest penalty.
No, but if you
compared to
will,
the
if
first
you will,
10.
if
Yes,
you
Mr.
will,
President.
if you will make them numbers 11, 12, and 13 after 10, after the enumeration 1 to 10, but that's the death penalty. Those
Well-
enumerated 1 to 10 deserve theoretically the death penalty.
Well, Mr. President, then they would deserve the heaviest penalty, although, of course, the good Mr. President knows that I oppose the death penalty, Mr.
Yeah,
President.
yeah,
Yes, Mr. President, but the gravest,
gravest
penalty. Yes,
penalty.
Mr. President.
So, okay. So, the minority leader is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I did not intend to avail of the spirit of interpellation, but the interpellation of the majority leader opened my eyes to a few areas which we would want to put on the record. So if the gentle lady will yield the floor to a few questions to start.
Very gladly, Mr. President.
Mr. President, is my recollection correct that today rape is no longer a private offense? It is a public offense. When we were studying law, we were told and it was emphasized that rape is among those that you cannot prosecute unless the offended party would institute the case. Now, that was subsequently amended so that, to my recollection, the present state of the law is that even without the consent, or even if without the consent, or without the complainant filing a complaint for rape, it is a public offense, and as long as there is evidence, the public prosecutor can prosecute the case. Is that the same law today?
Yes, Mr. President, and I thank the good gentleman, our minority leader, for pointing that out. Rape is no longer a so-called crime against chastity; it is a crime against person.
That's correct.
And for example, here in the bill, one of the proposed amendments is the repeal of the so-called forgiveness clause, precisely
right.
because it is
That's
a
what
crime
I'm going
against person,
to
Mr.
ask now.
President. Yes,
We
Mr.
are
President.
deleting Article 266C of the anti-rape law, or the forgiveness clause.
Yes, Mr. President.
That means that a husband who could be guilty of rape can be charged with rape even if the wife does not consent. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. President.
Mr. President, why are we intruding into what happens inside the bedroom? If the wife does not want to put her husband in jail, why would we allow the husband to be placed in jail? If the wife has forgiven the husband, who is the state to say, no, you're not forgiven, you should go to jail? Isn't this an overreach, Mr. President?
Mr. President, for one, the wife can decide not to testify, and also, Mr. President,
That's why
yes,
it's
Mr.
not a
President.
question of the wife does not testify. It's the wife saying, do not jail my husband. But the public prosecutor says, I have evidence that your husband raped you, and therefore I will charge your husband. If the husband gets convicted, you have a wife who has no more husband because the husband is in jail, even if she has forgiven the husband.
In point of fact, Mr. President, the main object of this amendment is to not extinguish a crime of rape which was committed before marriage by mere effect of the subsequent marriage. So that Article 266C, effect of pardon, is the subsequent valid marriage between the offended party shall extinguish the criminal action or the penalty
No.
imposed.
Mr.
That is
President,
what is,
the second
the
paragraph
amendment.
of Article 266C explicitly provides, in case it is the legal husband who is the offender, the subsequent forgiveness by the wife as the offended party shall extinguish the criminal action or penalty. Now, so a rape can exist, a husband, a legal husband can commit rape under Article 266C. And
Yes,
it
Mr.
is
President.
only the subsequent forgiveness of the wife that shall extinguish criminal action. Now, this Article 266C is being deleted.
Yes,
And
Mr.
therefore, the effect is that the forgiveness of the wife cannot extinguish criminal liability, as
Yes, Mr.
admitted by the sponsor, Mr. President.
I do admit it, Mr. President, because the bigger problem is that rape victims are forced to wed their rapists in order to extinguish the crime of rape, Mr. President.
The sponsor is focusing on paragraph 1.
Yes, that's
But,
what I'm pointing
yes,
out.
but
On
by
paragraph 2,
deleting-
it says,
yes.
in case it is the legal husband who is the offender. So, in other words, it was already during marriage.
The measure, Madam Sponsor, also deletes the second paragraph
Yes.
because it deletes the entire 266-C.
That's what we're pointing out, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President. And the reason, Mr. President, is that this provision in the law, which states that the subsequent valid marriage between the offender and the offended party, well, again, this focuses on the earlier case, shall extinguish the criminal action or the penalty imposed, gives an easy way out for the offender, which incentivizes him to carry out the crime. Once a female victim marries the offender, she no longer has legal remedy to file an action for the rape that happened
That's-
before the marriage. But I am getting, yes, to the second paragraph, Mr. President. It also recognizes that if the offender is the legal husband, the subsequent forgiveness by the wife, who is the offended party, shall extinguish the criminal action or the penalty. And this, Mr. President, I said earlier the bigger problem was rape victims later on forced to marry their rapists. But this situation, that a rape may occur within marriage, if the criminal action or penalty is extinguished, this would only perpetuate gender-based violence under the shroud of marriage, which can involve a whole range of abuses, physical, sexual, and or psychological, that can happen over a prolonged period of time, including the time that a marriage, a legal marriage, can last. And this has been struggled through and amended in their laws also by other countries similar to us in level of development. The provision in the rape law which ends criminal prosecution in the event of marriage between the offender and the victim was abolished in Mexico in 1991, in Colombia in 1997, in Peru in 1999, and in Ethiopia in 2005. And very importantly, Mr. President, in India, under the Indian Penal Code, rape is a non-compoundable offense, an offense against society, even if committed by a husband, and is not a matter to be left for the parties to compromise and settle. In their landmark judgment, the Indian Supreme Court ruled that, again, this is the first situation we were talking about with the good gentleman, ruled that a rapist's offer to marry the rape survivor could never be a ground for letting off the guilty lightly for two major reasons. One, it would encourage the convicts to pressurize rape survivors to reach a compromise. And two, rape is a crime against society. And I believe, Mr. President, even, or my gosh, even or especially within the context of marriage, which is supposed to be the most caring, safe, even protective, that rape is and remains a crime. Rape can never be the subject of compromise and settlement, even in a marriage, Mr. President. There are studies showing that people committing sexual violence are top of the list, very sadly, victim's current husband or partner. committing 55.2% of the assaults. This is a 2013 NDHS study here in the Philippines, followed by former husband or partner, 29.9%, relatives, 6.1%, own friend or acquaintance, 3.6%, and priest or religious leader, 1.2%. So sadly, current husbands or partners commit 55.2% of the assaults as of 2013,
Yes.
showing that even marriage has to be protected against the crime of rape as a setting for that crime, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I can understand the passion of the lady sponsor, but a situation where a husband is charged with rape without the consent of the wife is something I think that is not in the consistent with trying to promote order in society. Number two, that where a situation where you see a grieving wife who has forgiven her husband, looking or confronted with the situation where the husband is sent to jail. Isn't it that marriage is an institution which we as a nation would look at as something, as an institution that we have to protect? In any case, we obviously differ with the sponsor on this issue, and at the appropriate time, we will in the amendment, we will probably ask that the deletion of Article 266C be reconsidered, and we will submit it to the body for their consideration, Mr. President.
I would be open to further discussing that with the good gentleman at the proper time, Mr. President. Maybe just 3 more points from me at this point in time. Anyway, Mr. President, only the victim can say that she did not give her consent. So if the wife says she gave consent, then no crime.
No,
of rape,
Mr. President, it is the forgiveness of the wife which is being deleted as a means of extinguishing the offense. The lack of consent is given because precisely there was rape. But the provision says it is the forgiveness of the wife which extinguishes liability, and that element is being deleted so that a public prosecutor can prosecute a husband against the will of the wife.
Yes, Mr. President. 2 more points from me at this point in time, Mr. President. Extinguishing, not allowing marriage to extinguish the crime of rape could not be inconsistent with promoting public order, Mr. President. Because if we argue for a single woman that the crime of rape against her should not be extinguished even by her forgiveness because rape is a crime against the person and is a public crime, then why should we not afford that same equal protection to women in marriage or married women? And secondly, Mr. President, definitely with every other member of this chamber, I believe that marriage is one of our social institutions that we wish to protect. And therefore, as under the current law, and all the more so under hopefully an amended law, we wish to preserve marriage as an institution where the members, each member of the couple, are fully taken care of and protected in their dignity and their rights, and never violated under a false shroud of protection for wrongdoing, Mr. President.
Mr. President, there are a few other items and matters that we wish to touch on this bill, which would request be done on a subsequent session. If the sponsor will permit, we can suspend our interpellation to a later date.
Certainly, Mr. President, and thank you very much.
But Majority Leader, can I ask one
Yes,
question?
Mr. President.
with the consent of the good sponsor.
Of course, Mr. President.
Section 7 of the measure provides an additional sentence to Article 266-D presumptions. What would be the effect of this, provided that the absence of physical resistance must not be taken as consent on the part of the complainant?
Thank you so much for pointing out that amendment, Mr. President. It's important for us to propose in the bill that we provide that the absence of physical resistance must not be taken as consent on the part of the complainant, because there is a wider range of sexual assault responses, including survival reflexes, than are currently recognized by the law. There are what are called tonic immobility, collapsed immobility, and dissociation, Mr. President. These are three survival reflexes that are reported to kick in before, during, and or after the onslaught of a sexual assault. And it's important to include these, Mr. President, in our consideration, because proving sexual assault is difficult, especially when the legal system seeks visible sign of resistance. Tonic immobility, Mr. President, is defined, for example, in a report this June of the Acta Obstetrica et Gynecologica Scandinavica Journal, as an involuntary, temporary state of motor inhibition in response to situations involving intense fear. This is what is commonly described as the freezing of sexual assault victims. In the sample of women in the study, Mr. President, 7 out of 10 reported significant immobility, and 8 out of 10 reported significant fear during sexual assault. There's a second survival reflex, Mr. President, collapsed immobility. The body becomes limp, and due to decreased oxygen, to dramatic decreases in blood pressure and heart rate, the brain receives less oxygenated blood. The victim becomes faint and may even pass out. Collapsed immobility is often displayed by children who pretend to sleep while being molested. However, this can be either a deliberate strategy, or they may be experiencing tonic or collapsed immobility. Both tonic and collapsed immobility are known to be triggered by 4 specific conditions: extreme fear, physical contact with the perpetrator, physical restraint, and 4th, the perception of inescapability. And the third survival reflex, Mr. President, is dissociation. It's a survival mechanism often seen in many victims of trauma, not just sexual assault victims. It may look like the victim is spaced out, while the victim feels unreal and disconnected from the horrible emotions and sensations of such an intimate violence. So to quote Jackie Hong in her Vice article, freezing and withdrawing are defensive responses, not consent. These are some of the reflex mechanisms, Mr. President, occasioned by 4 specific conditions that made it necessary for us to include in Section 7 presumptions that provided that the absence of physical resistance must not be taken as consent on the part of complainant. The provision, Mr. President, is a response to the cases, some of which I mentioned in the Supreme Court, saying that a mere attempt to resist is not the resistance required, Mr. President.
So thank you for that explanation, Madam Sponsor.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill 1252.
Any objection? Hearing none, motion is approved.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I move to resume consideration of Senate Bill 1439 under Committee Report 60.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
This is the Energy Virtual One-Stop Shop. The parliamentary status of the measure is we've already terminated the period of interpellation, so may we move to open the period of amendments.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
Move to recognize the sponsor, Chairman of the Committee on Energy, Senator William Gatchalian.
Gatchalian is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before my individual amendment, I would like to manifest that last August 31, 2017, I submitted the proposed text for my amendment by substitution for Senate Bill number 1439 under Committee Report number 60 through the Bills and Index. This proposed text already contains the proposed amendments of Senators Drilon and Recto. I would like to further manifest that the said proposed text was distributed by the Bills and Index to the Senators' offices on the same date. For my individual amendment, Mr. President, I move that we strike all text under the enacting clause under the last page. I so move, Mr. President.
To be very clear, we are now using what as our reference? This document labeled working draft as of May 31, 2017?
Yes, Mr. President, we submitted to the Bills and Index, to the Bills and Index.
What is this? This one.
Yeah.
This one. Ito na. This motion is just a preliminary motion because you will replace the text that you are deleting.
Yes, Mr.
Okay,
President.
so we now understand. So,
The minority leader and the majority leader does not
okay, so
understand.
can we have a
Can you explain it to us?
suspension? I will clarify.
Yeah, well,
Session
mini
is
suspension.
Session is suspended. Teka muna.
to include the proposals of the other senators?
Hindi ko ng procedure eh.
Sir, we talked, sir, sa Bills and Committees. Yun po yung procedure. We consulted po yung
Ako rin yung turo sa Bitsilinix. Under ko dati yun eh.
Sir, yun. Kasi,
Hindi mo kaya nagkagulo eh.
well, kami naman, sir, we consult kasi, of course, yung mga ganyan yung ones, sir. So, yun naman po yung sa atin. But pumayag naman po, sir, na dun po sa strike, tapos i-insert, tapos yung in-insert, yun na yung magiging basis.
Paano mo yung malalagay sa rest of yung
Kasi sir, nung nag-usap, kinausap nyo po kasi sir yung ibang senators, tapos di-exit na siya yung papasok ng amendments, kasi hindi na sila mag-amend individually. So, nakausap na sila. Tapos, pinunsultan na sila po sa amendment.
kung kalaban niya. I will move that it be recommitted.
Kasi we're very,
Because we are not prepared yet. I move that it be recommitted for final submission.
yun na nga naman. We try naman sir kasi
Yes, kaya nagkagulo eh.
matagal na kasi yung last week pa yung nagbigay sa mga senators.
Procedure ang pinalalabas nila eh.
But ano naman, we want to settle things na sa kasi hindi na magiging.
Kasi ngayon, ginagawa ng kasi shortcut. Because under the principle, an amendment is not, kaya nga ano ba, nagkaroon ng amendment by substitution. Kung tutusin, you have to read it line by line.
We actually asked about that. So, kung kailangan yun nga, yung advice naman sa
Kaya ang suggestion ko na, yung amendment by substitution, huwag dapat gagawin, dapat parating line by line. So, the code would know the legislative intent. Kapag amendment by substitution, anong pinalitan?
nagbigay naman kami sir ng briefing sa actually sa ano naman sir, like, actually, wala naman kami problema with doing a line by line substitution. It's just that your advice mo nila na institution. So,
Hindi naman tagal sinasabi ko, mali yung ginagawa mo.
kaya sir, excuse me, kumara.
Recently lang, sinabihan ko sa legislature. Use the line by line. Trabahang tamad yung amendment by substitution.
Sir, I think that you don't take it against us kasi kami
Hindi.
kasi you wouldn't want to dito po kasi sir 2 weeks ago by the court of yun po yung like yun po yung instruction sa
State ko na lang. State mo.
Di na, di na.
Session is resumed.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. President, may we ask the chairman of the committee on
Energy.
This is committee on, oh yes, energy. Committee on energy to restate the motion, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. For my individual amendment, I move that we strike all text under the enacting clause until the last page in order to be replaced by the text that was submitted to the Bills and Index last 31st of August 2017. I so move, Mr. President.
August pala. August.
Ito yun.
Okay. Any objection to the motion? Is the date correct? August 31? What is the correct date, please? Because I have a working draft as of May 31, 2017.
May we know from the sponsor,
The
Mr.
sponsor,
President,
please,
before we act on the...
We are, just to make sure that we are talking about the same document, Mr. Sponsor, what is the document that you are referring to
Mr.
replace the stricken off words?
Mr. President, it was received by the Bills and Index last August 31st, 2017 as of 11:30 a.m. So this is the working draft, Mr. President.
All right. In the copy that we have, Mr. President, before we act on the motion, it says working draft as of May 31, 2017, as submitted to the Legislative Bills and Index Surveys by Senator Gatchalian. What does this mean?
Mr. President, that came from the Bills and Index Service, that date of May 31st. But here in the receiving copy, as duly received by the Bills and Index, it's August 31st, 2017.
Kasalanan ng Bills and Index, kamali. So the Bills and Index,
Can we, a minute suspension?
Hindi tayo nag-ganyan, sir. Walang ganyang klase ng sa original.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, before we approve the motion is clear. This is a substitution after the enactment clause or enacting clause. We would just like to place on record that the copies received by the senators have a box on top which says working draft. We now urge that we disregard this particular box and the statement made in that particular box, Mr. President.
Okay, with that clarification, any objection to the motion by the sponsor, which in effect substitutes the text of the bill reported out by the committee with this new text? Okay,
Mr. President, just to reiterate, the text that will be substituted is based on the bill that we submitted to the Bills and Index, duly received on August 31st, 2017.
Correct. Okay.
Okay, any objection to the motion? Hearing none, the amendment is approved.
Thank you, Mr. President. To give time to the members of the Senate to study the proposed amendments or the amendment that was inserted, I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill 1439 under Committee Report 60.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
Mr. President, I move that we adjourn the session until 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Tuesday, September 5, 2017.
Is there any objection? There being none, session is adjourned until 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Tuesday, September 5, 2017.